outsiders. You were a misguided community leader. You were a predator. You have shown no remorse. This community needs protection from...
The first thing you must understand about the cabin is that it was never just a building. It was a repository of ghosts, a library of memories bound in cedar and stone. To me, it was the only real thing in a life that had become increasingly synthetic. My world, the one I inhabited from Monday to Friday, was a landscape of glass towers, humming servers, and the incessant, sterile glow of a computer screen. I was a systems analyst for a major financial firm in the city, a job that paid well but nourished nothing. I spent my days wrangling ghosts in the machine, abstract strings of code and data that governed the flow of invisible money. But the ghosts at the cabin were different. They were my grandfather's laughter echoing in the rafters, my father's quiet pride in a well-mended fence, my own childhood self chasing fireflies in the deep, velvety dusk. Nestled in a grove of ponderosa pines overlooking the crystalline stillness of Miller's Lake, the cabin was an anchor in the swirling chaos of my adult life. My grandfather, Samuel Sterling, a man whose hands were maps of a life spent working with wood and earth, had built it with my father, Daniel, over the course of 2 sweltering summers in the late 1970s. I was only 6 and 7 then, a self-proclaimed foreman of morale, a title I bestowed upon myself. My primary duties involved staying clear of falling 2x4s, providing ice-cold cokes from a red metal cooler, and offering unsolicited, and often unhelpful, advice. But I remember it all with a clarity that time has failed to blur. The sharp, clean scent of freshly sawn cedar mingling with the loamy perfume of the pine forest floor. The rhythmic symphony of construction, the percussive thud of hammers, the high-pitched whine of the circular saw, the communal grunt of effort as they hoisted the main ridge beam into place. Most of all, I remember the evenings. With the sun bleeding orange and crimson across the lake, we would sit on the unfinished porch, exhausted and content, the day's labor warming us as much as the nascent fire in the stone hearth. My grandfather would tell stories, his voice a low, comforting rumble, about the woods, the fish, and the stars that seemed close enough to touch in the profound mountain darkness. Every inch of that cabin was a chapter in our family story. The deep scorch mark on the hearthstone, a dark crescent in the gray stone, was from a marshmallow I'd spectacularly incinerated during a ghost story session when I was 10. The slightly mismatched floorboards in the guest bedroom were the result of a frantic repair my dad and I undertook after a monstrous winter storm sent a tree branch crashing through the wall. We were amateurs, and our patch was imperfect, but to me, that imperfection was a badge of honor. The hand-carved coat rack by the door, shaped from a piece of driftwood my grandfather had pulled from the lake, was his last completed project. He'd presented it to me on my 16th birthday, his knuckles swollen with arthritis, and said, "Every man needs a place to hang his hat and his worries, Alex. Don't you ever forget that." After my parents were gone, taken by a cruel and indifferent highway accident 5 years ago, the cabin ceased to be a vacation spot and became a sanctuary. It was my only tangible inheritance, a direct line to the 2 most important men in my life. It was my promise to them, and to myself, that their legacy of hard work and simple peace would not be forgotten. My job kept me tethered to the city, but every few weeks, I'd make the 3-hour pilgrimage north. The moment my car's tires left the pavement and hit the gravel of the long, winding driveway, I could feel the city's armor sloughing off me. I'd spend my weekends hiking trails worn smooth by 3 generations of Sterling boots, fishing for trout from the same weathered wooden dock, and losing myself in the worn paperbacks that lined the built-in shelves. It wasn't an escape from my life, it was a return to it. The only discordant note in this symphony of tranquility was the recent, and increasingly aggressive, presence of the Eagles Peak Property Owners Association. For decades, this area had been a haven for individualists, a loose confederation of property owners who valued privacy and self-reliance above all else. But as the city's pressures grew, so did its tendrils. More and more city dwellers, chasing their own rustic dreams, bought up land. With them came a desire for order, for uniformity, for community standards. And the self-appointed champion of this new world order was a woman named Brenda Clark. Brenda was a recently retired executive from some Fortune 500 company, a woman who radiated an aura of unyielding, weaponized competence. She had moved to Eagles Peak full-time and, finding retirement dreadfully boring, had poured her formidable corporate energy into creating and dominating the HOA. She was elected its first president, a position no one else had the time or inclination to contest. Initially, her efforts were benign, almost welcome. She organized a neighborhood watch, coordinated a brush-clearing day to mitigate fire risk, and even planned a surprisingly pleasant community potluck. But the friendly mask soon began to slip, revealing a steely jaw of authoritarianism beneath. Her weekly e-newsletter, The Eagle's Eye, started as a folksy update and slowly morphed into a list of decrees. New rules began to proliferate like invasive weeds. There were regulations on the precise Pantone shade of brown permissible for mailboxes, bylaws dictating the maximum height of a firewood stack, and a pre-approved list of aesthetically harmonious flora for one's garden. My personal run-ins with Brenda had been, until now, minor skirmishes in a cold war of attrition. I received a formal notice, delivered via certified mail, informing me that the wild lupin and Indian paintbrush I allowed to grow freely on my property were deemed unruly and visually discordant. I was instructed to replace them with sterile, non-native boxwoods. I used the letter as kindling. On another occasion, I found a laminated note tucked under my windshield wiper, a masterpiece of passive aggression detailing the visual pollution caused by my 15-year-old aluminum fishing boat, which was parked discreetly beside the cabin under a heavy-duty tarp. I dismissed her as a petty tyrant, a queen ruling over a kingdom of manicured lawns and compliant neighbors. She was a mosquito buzzing in the periphery of my peaceful existence, an annoyance to be swatted away and forgotten. I failed to recognize the deep, obsessive hunger for control that drove her. I never imagined she was not a mosquito, but a predator, patiently waiting, watching from the manicured perfection of her own yard. I never fathomed the audacious, criminal lengths she would go to in order to excise what she perceived as a blight from her perfect, orderly world. The calm before the storm was a glorious autumn, the kind that makes you believe the world can be perfect. The aspens were a riot of gold against the dark green of the pines, and the air was sharp with the promise of winter. I was at my desk in the city, planning my upcoming trip to winterize the cabin, when my phone rang. The name on the screen was George Hemlock, and with that call, my world began to fracture. George Hemlock was a local institution. He owned the Miller's Lake Hardware and Feed, a store that smelled perpetually of sawdust, fertilizer, and old-fashioned decency. He had sold my grandfather the nails to build the cabin and had taught my father the best lure for catching bass in the heat of August. His voice, usually a slow, comforting drawl, was tight with an uncharacteristic urgency. "Alex, George Hemlock here," he said, the crackle of the connection underscoring his unease. "Sorry to bother you at work, son, but I think you've got a problem up here." A familiar knot of homeowners' dread tightened in my gut. In the mountains, a problem could mean anything from a bear tearing apart your trash cans to a tree branch punching a hole in your roof. "What is it, George?" "Another fallen pine." "Wish it was that simple," he replied, his voice dropping. "There's a for sale sign on your lawn, Alex. A big, glossy one. From one of those fancy city real estate firms." I let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure disbelief. "That's impossible, George. You must have the wrong place. The old Henderson lot next to mine finally sold. I bet that's what you're seeing." "Alex," George said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm parked on the road right now, looking at it. It's staked into the ground not 50 feet from your porch. Your address, 114 Miller's Lake Road, is on a little plaque right at the bottom. I got out of my truck to make sure. It says, Lakefront Gym, Motivated Seller." The words hung in the air, grotesque and alien. Motivated seller. I felt a wave of dizziness, as if the floor of my office had suddenly tilted. Motivated? George, I'm not selling. You know that. I'd sell my own soul before I sold that cabin. I know, son. That's why I'm calling. Something's not right here. You'd best get up here and see for yourself. The 3-hour drive was a fever dream of anxiety and denial. My mind, usually so adept at finding logical patterns, was a frantic storm of irrational possibilities. Was it a bizarre, elaborate prank? Had the real estate company made a colossal, unbelievable error? With every mile that passed, the flimsy explanations dissolved, leaving behind a cold, hard stone of dread in my stomach. By the time I turned off the main highway and onto the familiar, winding road that led to the lake, my hands were slick with sweat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. And then I saw it. It was worse than George had described. It was a visceral violation, a garish scarlet and white wound on the landscape of my memories. It was staked into the very patch of earth where my father had taught me how to properly cast a fishing line. It wasn't just a sign, it was an advertisement for my own erasure. Below the bold, insulting words, there was a professionally shot photo of my cabin, looking serene and beautiful, as if it were posing for its own executioner. And below that, the smiling, airbrushed face of a woman I'd never seen before. A rage, colder and purer than any emotion I had ever experienced, eclipsed my shock. I slammed the truck into park, the tires spitting gravel. I strode to the sign, gripped its cold metal legs, and ripped it from the ground with a strength I didn't know I possessed. The sound of the metal shrieking as it bent was immensely satisfying. I hurled it into the bed of my truck, where it landed with a deafening clang. My hands were shaking so violently it took me 3 tries to get the key into the lock of the front door. I stumbled inside, my breath catching in my throat, half expecting to find the place ransacked, emptied, already being staged for strangers to walk through and judge. But everything was as I had left it. My grandfather's worn leather armchair sat by the hearth. The faint, comforting scent of wood smoke, pine, and old paper filled the air. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes. It was all there, but the peace was gone. The soul of the place felt violated. I was no longer the owner. I was an intruder, a ghost in the hallowed halls of my own past. My first call was to the number on the sign. A cloyingly cheerful voice answered on the second ring. Cynthia Moore, turning houses into homes. How can I help you? My name is Alex Sterling, I said, my voice a low, controlled tremor. You have placed a for sale sign on my property at 114 Millers Lake Road. I didn't hire you. I'm not selling my home. I want to know who in the hell gave you the authority to list it. There was a moment of silence, punctuated by the soft clicking of a keyboard. Ah, yes. The Sterling property. A charming cabin, absolutely beautiful listing. We've had a dozen calls already. We have a showing scheduled for this Saturday. The casual, business-as-usual tone of her voice sent a fresh spike of fury through me. You're what? Who authorized this? Who signed the listing agreement? Her professional veneer developed a hairline crack. The owner did, of course, sir. We have a legally executed contract. All the paperwork is in order. I am the owner. I ground out, each word a chip of ice. And I didn't sign a damn thing. Let me just check the file, she said, her voice now tinged with confusion. The owner of record who signed the agreement is a Ms. Brenda Clark. The name landed like a punch to the gut. Brenda, of course. The sheer, magnificent audacity of it was her signature. It was so insane, so far beyond the pale of normal human behavior, that it could only have been her. Brenda Clark is the president of my HOA, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She is not the owner of my property. I am. I inherited it. My name, Alexander Daniel Sterling, is on the deed filed with the county. It has been in my family for over 40 years. I don't understand, Cynthia stammered, the saleswoman replaced by a flustered employee. Ms. Clark provided us with extensive documentation. A copy of the deed, the property title. She explained the situation. That the property was an HOA-managed foreclosure due to long-standing code violations and a significant amount of unpaid fines. Unpaid fines. Code violations. The wildflowers. The fishing boat. It all clicked into place. She had been building a fraudulent case against me, brick by imaginary brick, right under my nose. There are no violations. There are no fines. This is a fabrication, I spat. She has committed fraud. She has forged legal documents. And you, Ms. Moore, are now an accomplice. You will take down the online listing for my home immediately. Not in an hour. Not by the end of the day. Right now? Then you will call me back to confirm it is done. If that listing is still active in 10 minutes, the next person you will be speaking to will be my attorney. The syrupy sweetness in her voice had curdled into a defensive chill. Sir, I have a signed contract. I can't just. 10 minutes, I said, and hung up. I stood in the profound silence of my cabin, the weight of my family's history pressing in on me from the hand-hewn walls. This was no longer about petty rules and passive-aggressive notes. This woman, this suburban despot in her lakeside fiefdom, had not just trespassed on my land. She had attempted to hijack my history, to steal the very soul of my family. She had declared war, and I was going to finish it. My fury was a white-hot furnace, but I knew that rage alone wouldn't win this fight. I needed a plan. I needed a professional. I called George back, my voice steadier now, forged in the cold fire of purpose. George, who's the best, meanest, smartest lawyer in town. He didn't hesitate. Ben Carter. His office is above the pharmacy. He's an old dog, but he's got teeth of iron, especially when it comes to bullies. Ben Carter's office was a throwback to another era. It was cluttered with towers of law books, dusty file boxes, and the faint, pleasant smell of old paper and pipe tobacco. Ben himself was a portly man in his late 60s with a florid face, a cascade of white hair, and eyes that twinkled with a shrewd intelligence. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket and greeted me with a handshake as firm and reassuring as granite. He listened to my story without interruption, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression shifting from mild interest to focused intensity. I showed him the photo I'd taken of the for sale sign and the online listing, which, true to my threat, had vanished. Cynthia Moore had called me back, stammering apologies, promising a full internal investigation. When I finished, Ben leaned back in his ancient, creaking leather chair and let out a long, low whistle. "Well, son," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "In my 40 years of practicing law in this county, I've seen HOAs try to pull some monumental nonsense. I've seen them measure the height of a man's grass with a ruler and fine him for having the wrong breed of dog. But I have never, ever, seen one attempt to commit grand larceny through fraudulent real estate listings. This isn't just breaking bylaws. This is a spectacular display of multiple felonies." His calm, professional outrage was the most comforting thing I had heard all day. "So what's our move?" I asked, feeling like a soldier awaiting orders. "We launch a multi-front assault," Ben said, a predatory glint in his eye. "First, I'm drafting a cease and desist letter to Ms. Cynthia Moore and her brokerage that will not only demand they preserve all documents and communications related to this fraudulent listing, but will also put them on notice for potential civil damages. I'll CC the State Real Estate Commission and their corporate legal department. That should ensure their full cooperation. Second, you and I are going to the county courthouse. We'll get a certified copy of your deed and the full property history. We build a fortress of undisputed legal fact. Third, we take that fortress and we go to the sheriff." While Ben marshaled the legal forces, I decided a direct reconnaissance mission was in order. I drove back to the lake, my truck's engine a low growl of righteous anger, and went straight to Brenda Clark's house. It was one of the newer, grander homes, a sprawling 2-story affair with a 3-car garage, and a lawn so unnaturally green and uniform it looked like it had been installed with a level. She was in her front yard, wearing pristine white capri pants and a pink polo shirt, using a small pair of silver scissors to meticulously snip dead heads off her rose bushes. She looked up as my truck crunched to a halt on her perfectly paved driveway, her face a mask of polite, feigned surprise. "Brenda," I said, my voice flat and even. "We need to talk." "Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice a symphony of condescension. "What an unexpected visit. If this is about the notice regarding your unapproved watercraft, I assure you the fine is quite firm. This is about you committing felony fraud," I said, cutting through her script. "This is about you forging documents and illegally listing my family's cabin for sale." She didn't flinch. She didn't even have the decency to look surprised. She simply made another precise snip at a rose bush, the silver blades glinting in the sun. "I believe you'll find it's no longer your cabin, Mr. Sterling. It is now an asset of the Eagles Peak Homeowners Association." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the lie almost knocked me off my feet. On what planet is that true? On the planet where property owners are expected to abide by the covenants they agreed to, she said, finally turning to face me, her eyes cold and reptilian. "You received numerous warnings about your multiple code violations. You failed to remediate them. You failed to pay the escalating fines. The bylaws, which I suggest you read, are crystal clear. The association has the right to place a lien on, and subsequently foreclose on, properties that are chronically non-compliant. What fines? What warnings? I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. I never received a single notice. I have receipts for the certified mail I sent to your city address, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Your failure to collect your mail is not my responsibility. Frankly, it's a blessing in disguise. The property has been a blight on this community for years. An absentee owner who allows his property to fall into disrepair brings down the value for all of us who take pride in our homes. The community will be far better off with a family who intends to be an active and compliant part of it. It was the calm, rational, almost bored way she delivered this litany of lies that was so profoundly chilling. She had constructed an entire, self-contained reality, a legalistic fantasy in which she was the righteous arbiter of community standards, and I was a delinquent who deserved to have his property confiscated. You are a liar and a thief, I said, my voice shaking with a rage that was almost blinding. You forged a deed. You are becoming hysterical, and you are trespassing, she said, her voice turning to ice. She pulled a smartphone from her pocket. If you do not remove yourself from my property immediately, I will have the sheriff do it for you. I knew I couldn't win a battle of words with a sociopath. She was immune to reason, to shame, to truth. I turned and walked back to my truck, her smug, triumphant gaze burning a hole in my back. The war had just begun, but I now understood my enemy. She wasn't just a bully. She was a predator, and she believed herself to be completely above the law. The next few weeks were a maelstrom of legal maneuvers and simmering anxiety. The first victory was swift. Ben's letter to the real estate brokerage had the effect of a tactical nuclear strike. I received a personal call from their regional vice president, who was practically sobbing with apologies. He assured me they had severed all ties with Brenda, that Cynthia Moore was on indefinite leave, and that they would cooperate fully with any investigation. Next, Ben and I went to the sheriff's department. The first deputy we spoke to was young and dismissive, clearly writing it off as a civil dispute between neighbors. But when Ben Carter laid out the evidence, the fraudulent listing, the forged deed Brenda had allegedly shown the realtor, and used phrases like felony forgery and attempted grand theft of real property, the deputy's attitude changed. He called in his superior, a seasoned detective named Wallace, who listened to our story with a grim, focused expression. He took our file, promised a thorough investigation, but warned us that these cases were complex. We need to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt, Wallace explained. Right now, she can claim it was all a big, stupid misunderstanding based on the HOA's bylaws. We need something that shows she knew she was breaking the law and intended to profit from it. Brenda, meanwhile, escalated her campaign. I had a state-of-the-art security system installed at the cabin, with motion-activated cameras that fed a live stream to my phone. A few days later, my phone buzzed with an alert. I opened the app and watched, my blood turning to ice, a live feed of Brenda Clark standing on my porch, directing a locksmith who was actively drilling out the lock on my front door. I called 911, my voice a strangled cry of rage. There is a woman breaking into my house at this very moment. Her name is Brenda Clark. This is not a drill. Send a car now. By the time a patrol car arrived, sirens wailing, the locksmith had vanished. Brenda was on the porch, cool as a cucumber, holding a new, shiny brass lock in her hand. She presented the young deputy with a sheaf of papers, the fraudulent foreclosure documents she had manufactured, and claimed she was the HOA property manager tasked with securing an abandoned asset. She was so calm, so authoritative, that the young deputy was completely flummoxed. He made her leave, but he didn't arrest her. He filed a report, but told me later, "It's her word against yours, Mr. Sterling. She has paperwork. It looks like a civil issue." Brenda wasn't just a criminal. She was a brilliant, manipulative performer. But her arrogance was a fatal flaw. She believed she had outsmarted everyone. She believed she was untouchable, and that belief would be her undoing. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely of sources. An elderly widow named Marian Gable, who lived 2 lots down from me, called me one evening, her voice a frightened whisper. She was one of the original residents, and Brenda had terrorized her for years over the state of her bird feeders. "Alex," she whispered, "I know you're not supposed to talk about these things, but I have to tell you something. Brenda held a special HOA meeting last night. She told everyone you'd abandoned the cabin and that the HOA had taken possession. She said she was selling it on behalf of the community to cover your debts and to fund a new community gazebo and pickleball court. That's her cover story. I sighed. I know. But that's not all, Marian said, her voice trembling slightly. This morning, I was out in my garden. She was on her deck, talking on her phone. She talked so loud, you know. She was angry, complaining that the real estate company had lost their nerve. And then she said it. She said, "It doesn't matter. I have a private cash buyer lined up anyway. It's cleaner this way. No commissions. We're meeting at the cabin on Saturday. He's bringing a cashier's check, and I'm bringing the keys." My heart stopped. This was it. This was the proof Detective Wallace needed. This was no longer about a non-existent community gazebo. This was about putting a large sum of cash directly into her own pocket. This was clear, undeniable, criminal intent to profit. I thanked Marianne profusely, promising her she would be kept safe and anonymous. Then I immediately called Ben, my voice electric with excitement. "Ben," I said, "the serpent has offered us the apple, and we are going to take a great big bite." The plan we hatched with Detective Wallace was elegantly simple, a piece of theater designed to give Brenda enough rope to hang herself. The private cash buyer would be replaced by an undercover officer. The meeting would go ahead as scheduled. The entire transaction would be recorded on audio and video. My role was the most difficult. I was to be a ghost, an observer, parked down the road in Wallace's unmarked car, listening to the fate of my family's legacy unfold through a wire. Deputy Sarah Evans was chosen for the undercover role. She was sharp, unflappable, and had a disarmingly friendly demeanor that could put anyone at ease. We held a strategy session in a sterile briefing room at the sheriff's department. Evans studied the file, memorizing the name of the real buyer Brenda was expecting, a name Mary Ann had thankfully overheard. She asked me questions about the cabin's layout, its quirks, the view from the deck. She was building her character. "She's going to try to sell you on the place," I told her. "Comment on the stonework of the fireplace. My grandfather built it with river stones from the lake bed. It'll make you seem authentic." The Saturday of the sting dawned gray and moody, the sky the color of slate, a light, spitting rain misting the air. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I sat in the passenger seat of Wallace's unmarked Ford, a tangle of nervous energy and righteous fury. Ben Carter was in the back seat, a silent, reassuring presence. We were parked at a bend in the road, shielded by a stand of aspens, with a clear line of sight to my driveway. "The arrogant ones are the easiest," Wallace murmured, his eyes fixed on the road. "They never see it coming. They write the script, and they can't imagine anyone deviating from it." Right on cue, a modest blue sedan, Deputy Evans's car, drove past us and turned into my driveway. A few minutes later, Brenda's gleaming white Lexus SUV followed, crunching confidently over the gravel. My stomach clenched into a painful knot as I watched her get out. She was dressed in a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She looked like a legitimate businesswoman closing a major deal. She strode up to my porch, produced a key, a copy she must have had made after illegally changing my lock, and opened the front door to my home, welcoming the buyer inside. The audio feed crackled to life in Wallace's car. The sound was crystal clear. "So glad you could make it." Brenda's voice was saccharine, dripping with false warmth. Come in, come in. I've had the place professionally cleaned for you. As you can see, the view of the lake is just spectacular, even on a dreary day like today." "It's wonderful," Deputy Evans replied, her voice a perfect blend of excitement and polite negotiation. "Exactly as you described on the phone. And the fireplace. The stonework is incredible, isn't it?" Brenda preened. "All local river stone. A real artisan piece. Now, I know you wanted to handle this quickly and quietly, so I've brought all the necessary paperwork." We could hear the rustle of papers, the click of a briefcase latch. "I have the deed of sale right here," Brenda continued, her voice all business. "Signed, notarized, and ready for your signature. Once you sign and we have the funds, I'll hand over the keys, and the cabin is all yours. We can file the deed with the county clerk first thing Monday morning." "Perfect," Evans said. "And you have the cashier's check?" This was the crux. The moment the illegal transaction would be consummated. "I do," Evans replied calmly. Made out to the Eagles Peak Homeowners Association, as you instructed, for the full, agreed-upon amount of $350,000. I let out an involuntary gasp. The number was staggering. She wasn't just trying to pay for a pickleball court. She was trying to cash out my family's entire legacy, a property easily worth twice that on the open market, and funnel it through an account she alone likely controlled. Excellent, Brenda chirped, the greed almost palpable in her voice. If you'll just sign here on the deed, and on the sales agreement here. There was a long, pregnant pause. I could picture the scene in my mind, the pen hovering over the fraudulent document. Then, Deputy Evans's voice came back over the wire, but it had changed completely. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, hard authority that could cut glass. Brenda Clark, she said, her voice ringing with clarity for the recording. You are under arrest for attempted grand theft, residential burglary, forgery of a legal document, and wire fraud. Brenda's confused, tinkling laughter filled the car. I'm sorry, what? Is this some kind of joke? Who are you? I'm a deputy with the county sheriff's department, Evans stated, her voice utterly devoid of emotion. And this is no joke. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it. The audio feed erupted into chaos. There was the sound of a table scraping, papers scattering, and Brenda's voice, no longer controlled and condescending, but a raw, animal shriek of rage and disbelief. You can't do this to me. I am the president of the HOA. This is a legitimate transaction. I have the paperwork. Let go of me. The paperwork is forged, the transaction is a felony, and you are under arrest, Evans repeated, her voice a steady mantra in the storm of Brenda's hysterics. Put your hands behind your back. Now, that was Wallace's cue. He put the car in drive, and we surged forward, the tires spitting mud and gravel. As we rounded the bend and pulled into the driveway, the tableau was frozen in time. Two uniformed deputies had emerged from the woods and were flanking a struggling Brenda. Deputy Evans had her in a firm arm lock. The cream-colored pantsuit was now disheveled, her perfectly coiffed hair a mess, her face a grotesque mask of apoplectic fury. She was still screaming, a torrent of threats and legal jargon. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. This is entrapment. I'll have your jobs. I am a respected member of this community. Then her wild eyes landed on me as I stepped out of Wallace's car. For a split second, her tirade stopped. Her jaw went slack. The torrent of rage was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. In that instant, the entire fantasy, the entire elaborate web of lies she had spun, disintegrated. She finally understood. She wasn't the queen of Eagles Peak. She wasn't an untouchable executive. She was a common criminal, and she had just been caught. Watching them read her rights, her face pale and slack, and place her in the back of a patrol car was the most surreal and profoundly satisfying moment of my life. The great and powerful Brenda Clark, who had built a fiefdom on petty tyranny, was brought down by the sheer, magnificent weight of her own greed. As the patrol car pulled away, taking her and her shattered delusions with it, a profound silence fell over the cabin. It was the sound of peace returning. The aftermath of Brenda's spectacular downfall was as messy and cathartic as a spring flood. The news of her arrest for attempting to fraudulently sell my cabin detonated in our quiet community like a bombshell. The story was so audacious, so villainous, that it instantly became the stuff of local legend. The Eagles Peak HOA, the instrument of her tyranny, imploded overnight. An emergency meeting was called in the community hall. It was standing room only. One by one, people who had lived in quiet fear of Brenda's weekly Eagle's Eye newsletter and her constant threats of fines stood up and found their voices. Marian Gable, her voice trembling but resolute, told the assembled crowd how Brenda had threatened to have her beloved dog taken away for excessive barking. A young couple recounted how she had tried to force them to cut down a 100-year-old oak tree because its leaves fell into her yard. Story after story poured out, a collective exorcism of years of pent-up resentment and intimidation. The old HOA board, all of them Brenda's hand-picked sycophants, resigned in a wave of public shame. A new interim board was elected, their sole mandate to dismantle Brenda's draconian rulebook and restore a sense of neighborly sanity. The legal case against Brenda was, as Ben Carter gleefully put it, a prosecutor's dream. The evidence was a mountain. They had the forged documents she'd provided to the real estate agent, the sworn testimony of the locksmith she hired to commit breaking and entering, the flawless audio and video recordings of her accepting what she thought was a cashier's check for my stolen property, and the fraudulent deed she'd handed to Deputy Evans. Her high-priced lawyer from the city attempted to paint her as a dedicated, if overzealous, civil servant who had simply misinterpreted the HOA bylaws. He argued she was acting not for personal gain, but for the good of the community. That argument evaporated when the prosecution presented her personal bank records, revealing a shell corporation she had set up to which the Eagles Peak HOA account was directly linked. The pickleball court was a fiction. The gazebo was a lie. The $350,000 was meant for one person and one person only, Brenda Clark. She was charged with a litany of felonies, the most serious being residential burglary, forgery of a legal document, and attempted grand larceny over $100,000. Each carried a potential sentence of several years in prison. I had to testify at the trial. Sitting in the witness box, looking out at her sitting at the defendant's table, I felt not hatred, but a kind of weary pity. She looked smaller, diminished, stripped of her power suit and her aura of untouchable authority. When the prosecutor asked me to describe what the cabin meant to me, I didn't talk about its monetary value. I talked about the smell of sawdust and my grandfather's calloused hands. I talked about learning to fish with my father off the old wooden dock. I talked about it being the last place on earth where I felt connected to them. My voice cracked once, but I got through it. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. At her sentencing, the judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness, looked down at Brenda from the bench. "Ms. Clark," she said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom, "you were not a misguided community leader. You were a predator. You used a position of trust to terrorize your neighbors and to orchestrate a calculated, sophisticated scheme to steal a man's home, his heritage. You have shown no remorse. You have shown only outrage at being caught. This community does not need more rules and regulations. It needs protection from people like you." She sentenced Brenda Clark to a cumulative term of 10 years in state prison. A gasp went through the courtroom. Brenda seemed to collapse in on herself, her face ashen. As the bailiffs led her away in handcuffs, she looked over at me one last time. Her eyes were not filled with remorse, but with a look of pure, venomous hatred. It didn't touch me. The war was over. I had won. It took time for the feeling of violation to fully recede. The first few times I returned to the cabin after the trial, I felt like an intruder in my own memories. I would check the locks, walk the perimeter, half expecting to find another sign, another note. But slowly, with each passing season, the peace began to seep back in. I hired a local carpenter to help me replace the front door and the frame the locksmith had damaged. As we worked, the smell of fresh-cut cedar filled the air, a scent of healing and renewal. The community at Eagles Peak was reborn. The new HOA was a minimalist entity, concerned only with the truly essential things like road maintenance and fire safety. The endless rules vanished. People planted wildflowers. They painted their mailboxes bright, cheerful colors. They talked to each other over their fences, not as potential violators, but as neighbors. I even joined the new board, determined to ensure that no one like Brenda Clark could ever take root there again. Today, years later, as I sit on the porch my grandfather built, watching the sun set over the lake, the cabin feels more mine than ever. The ordeal, as traumatic as it was, forged a new, stronger bond between me and this place. It wasn't just an inheritance anymore. It was a victory. I had fought for it. I had defended its honor, its history, its silence. My grandfather once told me that every man needs a place to hang his hat and his worries. I had to face down a monster to keep mine. And now, the profound silence that envelopes this old cabin is not an absence of sound. It is a presence. It is the quiet hum of resilience, the deep, resonant peace of a home that has been fought for and a home that has been saved.